Noted, and I call the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It is vital that when we talk about disaster risk reduction, as the Minister has, and I welcome his statement, that we look at all aspects of managing, preparing for, recovering from, and also mitigating the risks that we face. And, you know, in terms of what we've seen in these bushfires, which of course had a shocking impact on my electorate, on the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury, we need to look at infrastructure that would have made a difference, making sure power supplies are there, making sure people can get calls or texts on a mobile, making sure that there's backup systems for landlines and internet, because in many cases people lost all communication. And the only connection they had with the outside world was through the ABC, which is also something we should be looking at in terms of risk reduction, making sure that when we can't reduce the risks, the systems we need in place are there. So there are massive infrastructure needs. It will also be really important for locals to be involved in that planning process. Every area is different. And I think what we saw during these fires, how important local knowledge is in the planning and preparation. We also need to use the Indigenous knowledge that we have of our land. So I think all of those things are key. Our frontline people also have to be resourced so that they can sustain the sorts of disasters that we are likely to see. And so we've had a lot of focus in thinking about these things from a bushfire perspective, but in my electorate, it was only a matter of moments that the bushfires were over and the rain started, and that brought with it flooding and landslides, massive storms and trees down. So I think we have to make sure we don't confine our planning to one particular disaster. We know that as climate change continues, we are going to see more and more extreme weather events of all kinds. In talking about this today, I want to focus on the recovery stage, the things we have to plan so that we don't find ourselves in the situation we are now, trying to recover from this massive bushfire season. It is becoming more of a disaster every day. I was really pleased to hear the Prime Minister say back in January, we will do whatever it takes, whatever it costs. They are exactly the words that communities want to hear when they have been through something, quite frankly, unimaginable. Sadly, those words are not being lived up to with commitments on the grounds. The facts on the ground are not reflecting that sort of commitment from this government, which is why it is becoming a triple trauma for us. We've had fire, we've had floods, and now we have a failed recovery. I want to talk about some aspects of it, things that we can learn from this and things that need to be improved now. The first is, when you say you're going to set up an agency to oversee the recovery, you actually have to do it. You can't just create a desk in PM&C and put someone there and say, there we are, there's the agency. People expect transparency and they expect an agency to be created. At the same time, when you say you're going to put $2 billion aside for this, to start this recovery, they expect that money to be put aside. They don't expect it to be a notional fund, in other words, an imaginary fund. They expect it to be real dollars sitting there waiting to be used to support communities who are going through a really difficult time. And then they expect that money to flow, not to be held up in bureaucracy, not to have governments at different levels blame each other for it, not to have the passing of the buck that we're now seeing. We also expect, when you say you're going to give $76 million for tourism funding that will promote the areas that are bushfire affected and bring people back to those areas, that it is absolutely dedicated to those areas. And the reason I raise this is because I still think there are questions that need to be answered by Tourism Australia and the Minister on the record in this place about the commitment that was made. And I say this because of a report in the Cairns Post. And Chris Calcino, the journalist, writes that in response to concerns about how coronavirus is going to impact the Cairns community and the concern about local jobs, that Cairns will be a major recipient of a new $40 million campaign to reignite international tourism as the federal government opens up bushfire tourism recovery funds to destinations peering over a coronavirus travel cliff. The Morrison government will invest $25 million into a marketing effort with a significant focus on far north Queensland, money directed from a $76 million crisis package already announced for areas struggling in the wake of bushfires. Now, if that journalist has this story wrong, then we need to hear on the record what is not accurate. Journalists, having been one, don't typically just make things up. Someone has given him information. If it's wrong, we need to hear it, and we need to hear it in this place, because the people who are dependent on tourism in the Hawkesbury and Blue Mountains want to see that money being used to drive tourists to our region. We want them back. We want a full house. In fact, we need it because the small businesses, those, not even those directly in tourism, but those who suffer the flow-on consequences when tourism numbers are down, are really hurting. The promises that have been made are not being fulfilled. Only 5 small businesses and primary producers have been eligible or have received a grant. 5 have received a grant. I know of 1 in my community who's received a grant. You're excluded from the grants if you didn't burn down. So that means most people haven't even bothered to apply because they're not eligible, but those who have, the numbers are terribly low in terms of approvals. The bar for these grants is far too high, as is the bar to get a working capital loan, which is meant to help small business. Now, let me just give you an example of one small business. I've had emails from many, but this is Peter. And Peter runs a touring company, a wilderness touring company. He notes that his tours to the Blue Mountains Botanic Garden in Bilpin stopped totally for weeks and weeks during the fire. The Darling Causeway was closed, the Bells Line of Road was closed, the Blue Mountains Botanic Garden was closed for weeks. Yet he is not considered eligible for any sort of support. He can't apply for a concessional loan because, like many small businesses, he doesn't have anything that he can use as security. So he needs a grant to help him get through. He's already got through a really torrid time. He needs to be tided over until the numbers of visitors come back. And that's why our proposal that the government consider wage subsidies, it won't help every business, but some businesses will be helped by wage subsidies for their workers, whether those workers are casual or part-time or full-time. You know, it wasn't hard for the government to throw $10 million to North Sydney Pool, but it's really hard for them to give less than $250 a week to workers who have lost shifts. And, you know, I refer to people like Noel, who tells me that he works in the hotel industry and he has lost 2 of his 4 shifts a week. That's what he faces now. So the money is just not coming through. We've also proposed that there be a voucher for accredited accountants to be able to guide people through the grant and loan application process. These are the sort of supports that are needed. They're needed for individuals who are trying to get Centrelink support. They're needed for businesses who are trying to get business support. You know, I think in all of these things, what we've seen is just way more being promised than was delivered. You know, let me go back to what the Prime Minister said back in January: whatever it takes, whatever it costs. Now, my community is asking for modest support. They want the clean-up to happen fast. It's slow. There's still confusion about who's eligible and who's not. We want on-the-ground caseworkers to help solve these problems, to be able to bring together the multiple tiers. That's one of the things that we need to look at. How do we streamline the process so that there's not 3 levels of government all trying to do little bits of it. We need it to work in a cohesive, coherent, simple way, because when you've been through a trauma of a natural disaster, it's hard enough to think straight, let alone negotiate bureaucracy. So I hope that's what we see as we look at how we not only reduce disaster risk but improve the recovery process.